Good morning. Happy Saturday. Welcome to this weekend. Lovely day here in the Bay today. Beautiful sunny weather. Light little fresh breeze blowing as per usual. So welcome to session 6, part 6 on my series on conscious living. Today we're going to talk a bit about how do we live with compassion. And it's a tough session as well, probably as tough as the session on acceptance, because when it comes to compassion, many of us think that compassion only must go outwards, so compassion for others. But today's session is a lot about focusing some of that compassion, not only on others, but mostly on yourself, that it needs to start with yourself. If we just look at some of the religious teachings, some of those religious teachings speak to loving thy neighbor as thyself, doing unto others as you would have them do to you. Those biblical teachings and religious teachings never just say love thy neighbor or do unto others. It always includes yourself, and I think most of us forget to include ourselves in that compassion. So today's session we're going to talk a lot about how do we start feeling a bit more self-compassionate. And you know, one of the earliest myths we learn, and the earliest things we learn from our parents is don't be selfish. Share your chips with your brother or sister, or share your sweets. We must share. But sometimes we have to learn to be selfish if we're going to be selfless. And it's a big lesson that I had to learn. I think we become very people-centric or other-centric instead of including ourselves in that equation. So we have to be self-centric in equal quantities as to what we are being other-centric. Morning, Sean. Thanks for joining us. So let's go into today's session, and we'll start working through this complicated idea called compassion. So the objective today is to talk about what is compassion and what does this word actually mean. And many of us confuse this word a little bit with some other words, and we're going to talk about this. Hi, Ryan. Thanks for joining us. So we often confuse, when we talk about compassion, people think of this word sympathy. And one of the first things they teach us in psychology is to learn the difference between the word sympathy and empathy. And most of us don't know the difference between these two words. Most of us are sympathetic and not empathic. All right. So the difference between these two words, sympathy and empathy, is that sympathy is where we suffer alongside and we pity someone and we say shame. So the guy begging at the street corners, we'll go give him food. All right. Because we feel his pain and we can see that he's hungry. So we want to take that pain away. So we take on his pain and we give him that food or we give him some money. Whereas empathy, we recognize and acknowledge the other person's pain without taking on that person's emotions. We understand that they have pain, but that pain belongs to them and they are able to help themselves with a bit of assistance to get out of their situations. But we don't suffer together with that person. And it's quite dangerous to suffer with a person because we end up feeling sorry for that person. And it creates a dynamic which we're not going to discuss in today's session, but that will take you into a drama triangle and a lot of anguish in your life. And compassion, of course, and especially now, that's why we're having all these ideas around COVID and these clapping for the caring professions, those that are helping out in the hospitals. Those in caring professions, in any of the helping professions, doctors, nurses, psychologists, social workers, ministers, they can have compassion fatigue because so often they are helping others, but they are not seeking help themselves. They just don't have time to seek help, or they don't put themselves at the forefront of getting that help in order for them to be able to help others. But it's extremely important that those in the caring professions and anyone else that's other-centric takes time out of their days to be a bit more self-indulgent and a bit, like we've spoken about bathing, have that bath, take that holiday, take that break, because without that, you're not going to be able to help others. There's a very famous line, that you can have a life without a career, but you can't have a career without a life. So we've got to be very, very careful that we look after our lives and keep some balance in it. So the aim of this session and this talk today is to introduce self-compassion and how we should be kind and self-compassionate to ourselves. Okay, and we've touched on this and how not only to be other-centric, but also to be me-centric. And it's okay to be me-centric as long as you're not only me-centric, because that would become egocentric. And like I've said this before, we're taught not to be selfish, but the challenge would be, who am I not to be selfish? There is times when you should be selfish with your time. Morning, Sonia. Thanks for joining us. So we should be selfish at times and take some time out for ourselves to be quiet, to meditate, as I said, to bath or do something that you do. And it can be totally self-indulgent. It can only be something that just you can get joy out of, and that's okay. Right. And then we're going to touch a bit on this inner critic today. We're going to talk a lot about the inner critic and how the inner critic can be extremely destructive. And we can have these destructive self-critical thoughts and how we can have constructive thoughts. And we've got to ask, which is your default mode? And I'm going to show you through some exercises today, in today's session, how mostly our default mode is destructive self-critical thoughts. We're extremely judgmental about ourselves. So mindfulness is going to teach us how to become more aware of the self-critical voice, to be able to hear this voice when it's talking in the background, and then to embrace it rather than turn away from it or to try and shut it out. And this inner critic can motivate, and we can't do without the inner critic. It's extremely important, but as I'll show you in today's session, it's the nature of that evaluation from that inner critic that creates our problems and that negative self-talk, those automatic negative thought systems, and it starts sitting in our subconscious, and we start really beating ourselves down. So the inner critic does want the best for us, but it does so in a very hurtful, unproductive manner. It's almost like a boss that wants to whip and make people scared of losing their jobs in order to try and get them motivated. And that's an extremely destructive way of trying to motivate your staff. It's much better to lead with a carrot than a whip. So this inner critic also can increase the gap between your real and ideal self. This is who am I versus who do I want to be. And the inner critic keeps saying you're not good enough, you should be like that person, you should be like that family. So it can create a lot of internal conflict and internal strife. Then this is a bit from transpersonal psychology, but I do add it to this discussion. You know, in India and Nepal and some of the Eastern religions, they would greet with namaste. And it's also kind of come up even now in COVID and lockdown, instead of shaking hands, to greet with just putting their hands together and a slight bow. But a lot of people don't really know what this namaste means. And what namaste means, I think it's a wonderful phrase, because what namaste means, there's many versions of it, but essentially it means the divine in me recognizes or greets the divine in you. And again, I want to show you that there's two parts to that. It's not just me recognizing the divine in you, it's me acknowledging the divine in me, and that divine in me sees the divine in you. So both are important, me and the other person. Again, it's not just love thy neighbor, it's love thy neighbor as thou should love thyself. So it's extremely important. One of the most important affirmations anyone can do is to say this daily, this affirmation: I love and accept myself exactly as I am. I love and accept myself exactly as I am. And of course, there's changes that you'd want to bring into your life, but not many people can say that and say it and feel okay, saying I love and accept myself exactly as I am. Right, so let's move on. So today we're going to learn how to care a little bit more for ourselves. So in psychology, we taught we must have unconditional positive regard for our clients. And this doesn't mean that we agree with an abusive husband, but we have to learn to like the husband if he's the abuser. And we have to separate him from what the behavior is that he's doing that he might not need to be doing. Or if someone's got an alcohol addiction, we don't go that terrible alcoholic. It's someone who we have unconditional positive regard for that's struggling with an alcohol addiction, and we need to deal with that behavior. So we separate the behavior from the person. And this unconditional positive regard is something that we need to have for ourselves. We need to have an unconditional positive regard for ourselves, because only when we do that will we be able to love unconditionally others, as well as allowing others to unconditionally love us. Because many people as well that I've worked with are able to love others, but they don't allow others to love themselves. And that's because they don't love themselves and they don't respect themselves enough. So I just want to, when I do coaching with people, I lead with this poem. So I just want to read this poem to you quickly. You are unique. In all the universe and in all time, you are the only you. Never before and never again will there be another you. You have talents and abilities that are uniquely yours. No matter what you think of yourself, there's someone who depends on you. Your strength is the strength that they rely on. No matter what your circumstances and history, your life makes a difference. This world would not be the same without you. Never again will your footsteps be repeated on this earth. Never again will your journey be made. So be proud of who you are and what you've achieved. Stride boldly on your journey through life. Leave a trail that others would strive to follow. Think no timid thoughts. Take no timid steps. This is your life and it will never be repeated, so make the most of it. I think it's a very, very powerful affirmation, and to take it to heart and internalize it. And then just as an aside, Dr. Seuss has got this wonderful little saying where he says, today you are you, that's truer than true. There's no one alive who's youer than you. And I think just to take those words to heart as an introduction to today's session. So today we're going to talk about the inner critic, self-compassion, and the importance of self-compassion. So what is this thing called the inner critic? I want you to imagine yourself in a situation in which you were disappointed in yourself. This can be something fairly recent. It can be a mistake that you've made, some important goal that you failed to reach because you messed up. And I just want you to briefly just check in with yourself and think a little bit about how you speak to yourself when you mess up. And I'll give you 5 seconds to do that. I think automatically we'll have an idea of what happens when we do mess up and how we speak to ourselves. So what were the words that you spoke to yourself? What was the tone of that inner voice? Did you swear at yourself? Sometimes there's horrible speeches that come out when we're angry with ourselves. And how did that inner voice sound to you? How did it make you feel? Mostly we swear at ourselves. Mostly that tone is quite harsh and critical and biting, and it makes us feel terrible. It makes us feel dreadful. It makes us feel stupid, dumb, idiotic. All right? So the words are often accusatory, they're often reproachful, and they're extremely attacking. Okay, that you feel like you almost have to defend yourself. The tone would be hard, angry, one of disappointment. And it would generate all sorts of so-called negative feelings: failure, shame, guilt, inferiority, fear. And this inner critic, this internal inner critic often says, what's wrong with me? How could I let this happen? Why me? There's nothing I can do right. If I continue like this, I'm inevitably going to fail. I'm going to feel like a fool. I'm just not sure if there's a slide that comes up later, but we speak to us in such a harsh manner. And when I ask people, I think it might come up just now in a question, would we ever talk to other people like this? And the answer is definitely not. Would you talk to your best friend or a family member like this? And the answer would be no. And then would we let other people talk to us like that in the same way we talk to ourselves? And most people get quite a strong reaction to that and say, hell no, I wouldn't allow anyone else to talk to me like that. So why do we talk like this to ourselves? Why do we allow ourselves to beat ourselves down? Okay. Then we've got this external part of the inner critic where we're comparing ourselves to outside things. I look so fat in this dress. I'm hopelessly inept with the computer. I've got the worst sense of direction of anyone I know. I think I'm the worst cook on the planet. I wonder how many times I've made this mistake before. So it's as if we're saying, I'm going to beat you to the punch and criticize myself before you can. And I recognize how flawed and imperfect I am. So you don't have to cut me down and tell me what I already know. All right? And we carry on living out this low self-esteem, this level of insecurity. We might pretend at a conscious level that we're secure, but we beat ourselves down daily with this terrible way of talking to ourselves. So the inner critic's an internal voice that commands and sends extremely negative messages to us. Okay? And it sends 3 types of messages. The imperative, so these are the commands. You must be doing this, or you should be doing this. Disapproving thoughts, feelings, and behavior. That's it. Just, what are you doing again today? And then the negative predictions. You're not good enough. You'll never be able to do it. So don't even try. These are the 3 kinds, and I'm going to break it down into a little bit more detail. So the inner critic then has extremely a lot of intrapersonal consequences. So this is a long psychology word, relation to the etiology and preservation of different types of psychopathology. That simply means it relates to how it develops, that's the etiology, and how it preserves different types of mental illness, that's psychopathology. So depression, social anxiety, substance abuse, eating disorders, all of these kind of things the inner critic can create within you. Then on an interpersonal level, people who score high in self-criticism have less friends, and they're less satisfied with their level of social support. They use more negative communication after a stressful event, and they report lower levels of trust, and they share a very low amount of personal information. So they're never able to form close bonds, because forming close, trusting bonds, we normally have to be quite open, and the less we share, the less rapport we can establish with other people. So they become very unhappy individuals. And then the possible cause of the inner critic, of course, is children with parents who are highly critical, control-oriented, or performance-focused will obviously be more self-critical as they grow up and as they develop. And they will constantly feel like they're not doing well enough or not being good enough. So let's step into this idea of self-compassion. So compassion involves a sensitivity to the experience of suffering, coupled with a deep desire to alleviate that suffering. So sympathy or co-suffering means that both of us are suffering, and it means we victimize someone. We make like this, oh, shame. We put someone into a lower position than myself if I'm having sympathy and not empathy, and that's what co-suffering means. But compassion does involve an acknowledgement of that pain, understanding pain and suffering, and this is what empathy is. It's the acceptance of the person who is suffering, and of course wishing that suffering can decrease. But it's not rescuing that person. It's helping that person to rescue themselves. That's the difference between sympathy and empathy. It's this idea about buying someone a fish or teaching someone how to fish. So self-compassion is simply compassion that's directed inward, and it relates to ourselves as an object of care and concern when faced with an experience of suffering. There's a thing that always brings a smile to my face, and I had a client just 3 days ago, that took my advice, and after this, an exercise I asked her to do, she said she gave herself a hug. It's the first hug she's ever given herself. And you'd be amazed at how comforting a self-hug can be. And it's not difficult to hug yourself. With this COVID and lockdown, we're not even supposed to hug other people. So if you're not going to hug other people and they're not going to hug you, then give yourself a hug, because it does feel good. And it does, even that releases some of the endorphins in your body. So self-compassion is not this. It is not self-pity. It's not having a pity party. It's not going there, lying there and feeling sorry for yourself. Poor me. I'm isolated from all the rest, and have this emotional tunnel vision that it's only happening to me. I have such a terrible life. This is not what self-compassion is. What self-compassion is, and this is not a great example, but when you injure yourself, let's say, because I know I've hit my finger with a hammer and I have sworn and said, what a dumb person, how could I have done that? But if you injure yourself, let's just say you cut yourself badly on your finger, you were drying the dishes or something and you cut yourself, you'd be like, and you'd straight away go to the bathroom, wash it, put some Dettol on, Savlon, you'd bandage it up, tape it up, and you'd look after it. Okay, this is what self-compassion is, taking care of yourself how you would if you had to injure yourself. I think I had a motorbike accident in Matric. I got up back on the bike, rode myself to casualty, found a doctor, got the stitches, then called my mom. So you look after yourself. So this is what self-compassion is, but you're using this now when it comes to emotions and looking after your well-being. So the self-compassionate voice versus that inner critic voice says, I tried my best. I'm just like everyone else. I'm only a human being. I never signed a contract to be perfect. Perfection is a huge problem when it comes to this inner critic. And remember, we'll never be perfect. And I know I'm going a bit off topic here, but one of the things I say to people that are perfectionists, because many people are, or they strive for perfection, is that at varsity level, to get a distinction, you need more than 70 or 75%. So you can pretty much stuff up 25% of the time. So a distinction, or to graduate cum laude, is 75%. And that's not even close to 100%. There's 25% error margin, if you want to call it that. And you can still be considered graduating cum laude or with distinction. So don't try and be perfect. Try and be whole, or as close to perfect as you can be. Even if you just got to give yourself 5%, 95%, that will give you some breathing room at least. And then to say things like, I've learned something. I made a mistake, but I learned. I won't make that same mistake twice. And next time we'll do it differently. Some of the components of this: self-kindness versus self-judgment. We're going to talk a bit about these topics now. Common humanity, realizing that I'm the same as everyone else. It's not just happening to me. Versus isolation. And often when we think it's only happening to me, no one else is going through what I'm going through. And I've touched on this before in another talk where I spoke about part of my training. I spent 6 months in a private mental hospital, and we worked there with in groups, not in individuals. And the greatest thing about groups is that you realize in that group there's a common humanity, that everyone's got their problems, and it's not just me, and you don't feel alone with your problem. And you can sort of compare your problem to other people in the group, and it puts it into some perspective. And then mindfulness versus over-identifying with the situation you're going through. So let's talk a bit about kindness. So the part that's not kind is when you have this hard critical voice, judgmental, harsh, attacking the self, saying you're useless, continuing no matter what. So you just keep going and not learning anything from your mistakes, and you just keep doing, it's what they call in Buddhism, non-striving, but you keep doing the same thing and making the same mistakes. You stay in the same relationships, you keep going into these abusive relationships, and you can't understand why this keeps happening. But you're not stopping to pause. You're not being kind to yourself because you're thinking this is all that there is. So to be kind is a lot more caring and understanding and more accepting of the self. Stopping, pulling back, pausing, thinking about it, resetting, so to speak, and then deciding what to go. And a lot of internal focus on healing the self, okay? To start doing stuff like mindfulness, daily meditations, prayer, etc. And then this common humanity versus isolation. When you're isolated, it feels like it can only happen to you. And you feel isolated from anyone else who lives. When you look on Facebook, you see all these happy faces and you think everyone else is living these wonderful lives. But it's not like that. That's not true. All right? People don't really post their bad stuff on Facebook. So Facebook is this very, what do you call it? It looks like icing on a cake. Versus connection. So that having a common humanity. And when we have this connection, and when you feel like there's recent research out of substance abuse where they reckon a big part of why people abuse substances is this inability to make meaningful connection. They're not making meaningful connections with others. So it's experience that everyone fails and everyone makes mistakes, but also feeling connected with others. It's a big part of sharpening the saw, looking after your physical self, your mental self, but also your social and emotional self. It's extremely important to connect with family, to connect with friends. Even if, like now with the lockdown, even if it's just over Zoom. These talks every day, just by seeing some comments come up in my comment, is a wonderful way of feeling I'm connecting with everyone out there. And then the unawareness, okay, this is like mindlessness versus mindfulness. There's just no pause. We just carry on. So we like this on a treadmill, or we like this tumbleweed that's just rolling through the landscape. We believe all the negative stories to be true. So if I think that I'm crazy, or if I think I'm lonely, or if I think I'm never going to meet anyone, we believe these things to be true, but they're just thoughts. And then judgment and punishment. We're constantly downing ourselves and punishing ourselves for what's going on. Whereas in mindfulness, stop, pause, observe these negative stories, realize that they're just a story, realize it's just a thought. And I don't want to say it's okay to think that you're a loser, but it is, because it's just a thought. It doesn't mean that you are a loser. And to become aware of these judgments and punishments, and sort of just to put it a bit more into the background, and we call it radio doom and gloom, and just let this music play in the background without taking it on. And then the importance of self-compassion. So we spoke about how the inner critic affects us intrapersonally. So now we're going to talk about how self-compassion affects us intrapersonally. Definitely lowers your levels of anxiety and depression. There's less rumination, which means letting these thoughts go round and round and round your head. And there's less need to push down your thoughts, because it's just a thought, and I don't need to give it a lot of attention. And we have much better insight into our feelings and how to cope with different negative feelings. And then interpersonally, we become much more emotionally connected with others, more accepting, more autonomous, able to do things for ourselves, and more supporting of not only ourselves, but also others. And we have much more higher relationship satisfaction, because we're not so demanding on our relationships. We don't expect as much out of our relationships as someone does who has a strong inner critic. And remember, we've touched on this black and white thinking. So black and white thinkers are extremely judgmental and put a lot of pressure on themselves. And when they put a lot of pressure on themselves, they automatically put a lot of pressure on those that they're with. And there's less need to project your faults onto others or your partners via angry accusations or the blame game or labeling, etc. Okay, when you love yourself. If you think of the world's greatest leaders, that one can think about: Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, Gandhi, Mother Teresa. Most of those people are pretty chilled people. Don't make many demands on others and are quite okay with who they are, so don't get into big arguments and disagreements, because they actually like themselves. So, a common reason for people to reject this idea of self-compassion is they believe that it's going to cause a lack of motivation to address their own personal shortcomings. Some people tell me that the inner critic they like because it motivates them, even though it's an extremely destructive way of motivating. But the self-compassion has very good motivational effects. It gives you greater personal initiative to make needed changes in your life. Again, if you're in an abusive relationship, or if you're sitting in a relationship where your partner keeps cheating on you, I often say to people, how much do you respect yourself? How much do you love yourself if you're saying that this is okay? And it's easy to say, well, I love the other person, and I want to give them another chance. And it's okay to give them another chance. I'm not saying it's not. But if you loved yourself and if you respected yourself, you might not be so easy with keep on giving the other person chances. We have much more internal reasons for motivation, and because we won't need social approval. Once you like yourself, you don't need other people to like you in order for you to do what's important for you to do. And a much more greater intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation. This should be a talk on itself, because a big part about motivating people to study, to go and achieve something in their life, in their careers. Many people do it when I ask them, it's because my mom or dad told me to do it, or my wife or my husband said I should do it. No, that's extrinsic motivation, and you will never stick to it. So the best motivation anyone can have needs to come from inside, and we will only do it from inside once we can love and appreciate and respect and accept ourselves. So the motivation, if we have this emotion-based self-attack, again, this is talking about the two types of ways. So very emotional-based self-attack is the wish to punish and judge myself, very much anger and frustration, focusing on this complete or perfect version of myself that I need to have. And then the prevention and fear of failure. So I just don't try stuff sometimes because I'm too scared that I'm going to fail. Whereas a compassionate self-correction shows that you need that, and you've got this wish to improve. It's a very supportive version of yourself. You can focus on specific aspects of yourself that you're trying to improve, and focus on a lot of growth and hope for success. Okay, there's a big difference between an emotion-based criticism of yourself and a compassionate-based criticism of yourself. I think in another session we spoke a bit about this inner critic. You know, how would you support a friend if they were going through the same crisis you went through, and how would that friend support you? And it'd be very different to the way you do it. So the argument around self-compassion is to be to yourself as you would to a friend. So become a friend to yourself rather than a critic. And then I just want to read, just sort of coming into the final straight. Many of you have heard this before, wrongly attributed to Nelson Mandela, but it's from Marianne Williamson's book, A Return to Love, and it's Reflections on the Principles of A Course in Miracles, which is a wonderful book if you ever want to read something that's very deep and helpful. So this, our deepest fear goes like this, and I want you to take these words to heart. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You're a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There's nothing enlightened about shrinking so other people won't feel insecure around you. We are all meant to shine as children do. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It is not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. And as we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. So I think it's a great little idea for you to take away from today's session on self-compassion. I want to thank you for your attention. I want you to go reflect on some of the stuff today, because it's a tough session today. Like I said, it's as tough as that acceptance. And I think I need you to at least commit to each of you, to commit to yourselves, to giving yourselves some time to think about who am I and how should I love and respect myself more. And to say that affirmation, I love and accept myself exactly as I am. Thank you. Have a wonderful Saturday. Have a lovely weekend with your families and friends. And we'll chat again on Monday. Maybe I might do something on Sunday, but we'll see about that. Cool. Cheers.